tonight? Well, welcome tonight on my talk on Impressionism and British art. As you know, I've already talked quite a bit about Victorian painters and Victorian art from the 1837 to 60, and then I did the follow-up to that to the end of the 19th century. And this one parallels it in a way, because some of the art that we're going to see tonight was taking place at the same time. We're going to be popping across the channel, and some French artists are going to be popping over to London. And we're going to just see the links between particularly French Impressionism and French art and British art of the 19th century. And there's quite a lot of links. Some of them are not that obvious, actually, and we have to go back almost to 1819, really, where our story will all begin. So without further ado, I'm going to bring on my first slide. Here we go, sorry, my first slide really sort of introduces the scene. And we have the official art, really, of the mid-19th century. In the top left-hand corner, I have Thomas Couture's painting, The Romans in Their Decadence of 1847, a typical example of his work. Now, Couture was prominent within the salon in those years, and yet even he, in his atelier, had some of the most forward-looking artists of the era. He had Puvis de Chavannes. He was, of course, known for having Fantin Latour and primarily Manet as among his pupils. And so, whilst we can see little of Edouard Manet in this particular painting, either in painterly approach or in composition or indeed in subject, Couture was not a complete dud. He's certainly, his studio allowed for a number of artists to develop in very interesting ways. But the salon was all pervasive in the middle of the 19th century in Paris. And indeed, artists both in Britain and in France faced the monolith, either the Royal Academy or of the salon. A great artist of the Royal Academy at this time was Daniel Mclease, the little slide that I've got on the right, Noah's Sacrifice. Again, a classically formed composition, an artist who was involved in the Westminster murals that we've talked about in previous talks. And these institutions really were enormously powerful. We can't even, really is no parallel today. Certainly any artist wanting to make a living in art and to become known and have a viable income, showing at the Salon or at the Royal Academy was almost vital, and it made careers. It also broke careers too, and so it was enormously important. Had the amusing little cartoon of Daumier's there of the women attending a salon in 1864. And this painting on the bottom right-hand corner by Charles West Cope of the RA Hang Committee in the 1870s demonstrates a similar situation. The great academicians viewing the hopeful artists who were allowed to exhibit work on the say-so of the Hanging Committee. And we know that was fraught with difficulty and presented great problems to artists who were rejected. So, as I said, our story really starts in about 1820, 1821. And it starts with our wonderful, great landscape painter, John Constable. Hay Wain Noon, probably one of the best known paintings in Britain. This has an interesting influence upon the development of the relationship between French artists and Britain, and indeed in the antecedents to Impressionism. Because Theodore Géricault had exhibited his Raft of Medusa in 1820 in the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. And this was after it had been shown at the Salon to a mixed reception. And so it was taken to London, this enormous painting, which many of you will have seen in the Louvre, this great painting of the Romantic movement, the Raft of the Medusa. It was taken to London, and in 1820 it proved very, very successful in London, and so much so Géricault stayed in London for 2 years, the latter years of his life, and he visited the Royal Academy in 1821. And he was highly impressed by this landscape painting by John Constable. Now, it's unusual at this stage. There was a very much a ranking within works within the Royal Academy of historical paintings, portraiture and landscape, landscape being bottom of the pack of cards. But what interested Géricault about this painting was its actual physical approach and the way Constable actually applied colour and how he depicted atmosphere. And as we know, I will be talking later about Constable's technique and that, but he was very, very taken by this particular painting, the Haywain, in 1821. And he brought back news of this to France. And the Haywain was shown in the Salon of 1824 to great success, much more success than it had in London at the Royal Academy. And it was noticed by the then not so well-known artist, Eugene Delacroix. And Delacroix, having seen Constable's Haywain, was mightily impressed. And he actually cites in some of his journals that he had changed his approach to applying paint as a result of seeing Constable's lively brushwork and his ability to break tone by what we call scumbling, which is in fact painting a layer of paint over another layer of paint, but not a glaze. So the colour isn't thinned with a turpentine or an oil, but is in fact scumbled across the top of the canvas, creating a shimmering effect. And as we know, Delacroix's paintings were enormously influential upon the group which was later to become the French Impressionists. And because of his wonderful brushwork and certainly his very, very rich use of colour, and Delacroix was unafraid in the use of a very, very rich palette. And his scenes also, like Géricault's, were romantic. This one is the Lion Hunt, which is a typical painting of Delacroix. And so Delacroix was, Constable became, actually he sold more paintings in France than he managed to sell in England. And he was admired by a number of artists in France. And so it was good because Constable had an uneasy relationship with the Royal Academy. In fact, 2 years later, he had one of his paintings rejected by the Royal Academy, and he withdrew from the Royal Academy as a result. Took it as an insult. So it was a very interesting time in that a huge painting like Géricault's Raft of Medusa coming to London, and Constable's painting coming to Salon in Paris, and this at a difficult period too, because as we know, there were all kinds of political reasons why artists might not, there might be difficulties for French artists showing in Britain or British artists showing in France. We must remember that an artist like Géricault was championed by William Wordsworth, and so the Romantic movement was an international movement, and indeed Delacroix is a later flowering of that, and his paintings are absolutely marvellous paintings. This is just a loose translation of what Géricault had to say about colour within painting, but it's very apt to this particular talk. Remember, the enemy of all painting is grey. A painting will almost appear greyer than it is on account of its oblique position under the light. Now, this was echoing something that was beginning to bumble under in Europe, and that is namely Goethe's colour theory, which had been published in Germany in German in 1810. Now, Goethe came from Weimar, and these two paintings, I've given you two examples. One on the left is an example of a close-up of Constable's brushwork, which so enamoured Géricault and then Delacroix and other French artists. And here we have an example of Delacroix's brushwork from a similar period. So we can see this is massively zoomed in on the painting, but we can see both are quite innovative. There isn't this smooth surface, which was so loved of early 19th century painting and so loved of the salon. That paintings were very, very highly worked. We can think of painters like Ingres, whose paintings are almost glass-like surfaces. Not the case with either Delacroix, and certainly not with Constable. So an artist who, after the translation of Goethe's colour theory into English in, I think it was 1840, it's 1840, I have it here, painted Turner was always interested in the idea of light and colour, and he certainly took to the ideas expressed in Goethe's colour theory. And this is his painting you can see in the Tate Gallery, titled "The Morning After the Deluge, Moses Writing the Book of Genesis." Perhaps you can make that out within the sphere of light. However, it is also quite an abstract painting, but it concerns Goethe's colour theory and colour wheel. And Goethe's theory we could go into, but I'm not going to dwell on it too much here, but in relation to painting, it proved enormously influential upon artists of this period in the 19th century. Now, if you look at that little square at the top, this is just one of the examples from Goethe's colour theory with the black and the white quadrants with two little squares of grey. Now, you will probably perceive that the grey against the white is darker than the grey against the black. And yet, indeed, these two greys are exactly the same. They are the same grey. So Goethe was basically saying human perception is changed by a tone and by what surrounds it, whether it be a dark or a light. And he developed from Newton's prismatic colour theories, and these theories then started to enter into painting. Of course, artists had intuitively known this for a long time since the Renaissance, that the introduction of a colour into a shadow, or the reaction of colour towards the peripheries of objects changed. And this was something that Goethe, who was a polymath really, he for his living he was an administrator, but in fact he wrote on natural science, and as we know he wrote his great Faust, he wrote poetry, and he was a great mind of the early 19th century, and he had a great influence upon the visual arts as much as anything else. And so here we have the great Turner on Varnishing Day, 1846, painted by William Parrott. And it really sums it up, because Turner had taken this quite literally, that in fact, in light, this idea of light within painting was something very different to the optic light talked about by Newton. And a great example of this is in Turner's great painting of 1844 of Rain, Steam and Speed, which I've talked about before in my talks on Victorian painting, a highly modern painting, but apart from its depiction of a train, a very new train crossing the Great Western Railway Bridge of Isambard Kingdom, Brunel, it also relies a lot upon these new theories about colour and light within painting that were coming into visual art. And it was always remarked that Turner on Varnishing Day, I think I've got a little passage here about it, it says, Parrott caught Turner on Varnishing Day at the Royal Academy in 1846 in the act of touching up one of his submissions at the very last minute, and suggesting he was doing it not only because of his fascination with his own technique, urged him to continuously and nervously improve his art. So Turner, unlike the other artists who were just putting a nice mastic varnish on their painting so their painting could be seen in a good light in the great rooms of the Academy, Turner actually repainted some of his paintings even on varnishing day, and there's an example of it. And he was a diminutive man and quite an untidy and unkempt man, but an absolute genius. And there he is depicted on varnishing day. Now, I would say, a lot of people said, didn't Turner have a great influence upon the French Impressionists? Well, actually, there's very little evidence that Turner's paintings had as much influence as did the brushwork of Constable or through the mediation of Delacroix, really. So it wasn't until the visit of Monet and Pissarro in 1870 that French Impressionism fully encountered Turner. Another thing that was going on at the same time was this man here, and he was Michel Eugene Chevrelle. And Chevrelle was, in fact, he worked in a dye factory, but he was also, like Goethe, in similar, fascinated by the interactions of colours and how they worked upon the eye, particularly printed colour and printed cloth, and how it might work in things like tapestry. Now, in the 1840s, new dyes were coming onto the market, particularly the aniline dyes, which were synthetic colours, and they were producing beautiful pigments, such as this one on this beautiful dress of the period. We can see these in Winterhalter's paintings. We can see these lovely colours that were appearing in silken dresses and the wonderful dyes, which were taking indigo on to a further stage, and rich violets and yellows were now possible as a result of the dyes. Now, Chevrelle became very, very important to the French Impressionists because he noted that, in fact, every colour was intensified by its opposite upon a surface. So in a tapestry, if you had an orange next to a green, it would intensify that area. And likewise, if you did the complementary, like a red against its complementary green, it would intensify the red and the juxtaposition of the two. And those are examples from Chevrelle's little book in the top right-hand corner there of how certain colours can be intensified by the colours that surround them. And we'll come to this in the Impressionism. Now, in the state of landscape painting, there were moves towards a type of what we might call Impressionism in the earlier part of the 19th century. Our great painter who spent most of the time on the continent, Richard Parkes Bonnington, painted by the Seine in 1823, 1824, quite close to Giverny, where Monet was to take residence almost 60 years later. And this is a painting by him, a small painting, but a plein air sketch. And as we can see, it has some of the qualities of an Impressionist painting. At the same time, Corot was painting in the countryside around Rome, and that's a plein air painting by him at the Bridge of Narni in 1826. Holman Hunt, our own pre-Raphaelite painter, painted plein air, as we know, in a fastidious detail, but he also painted a small colour sketch, such as this one, this cornfield at Ewell in 1849. And if we look at the sky, we can see very much an analysis of colour and light going on in this. And the shadows certainly aren't grey, they are blue and they use violet. And at the same time, in 1850 in France, we have Daubigny's painting beside the Seine, which he was considered, Daubigny had a little houseboat which he put out onto the Seine to give him great light quality within his smaller paintings. They were finished in studio, but he was a precursor to what we know as the Impressionists. One great realist of the time who showed at the Salon and was a highly important figure in French art was Gustave Courbet from Ornans. We might know his famous painting, The Burial at Ornans, which is one of his marvelous realist works. His work is very important, not only in its approach, in its technical approach to painting landscape directly, but also the fact is that he is a realist. He declared that he would not paint an angel unless he saw one, and he certainly did not turn to classical subjects in the way that other artists did, even Manet did. He painted from life, and he painted things about life, and his paintings were brutally realistic. and often painted with quite large brushes and a palette knife. And we have a couple of very good examples in the Ashmolean Museum. And in the top right-hand corner, I've got a Boudin painting, which was painted at this particular period in the early 1850s. And again, an artist very influential upon the French Impressionists, and similar to some of the coastal scenes that we have seen, particularly in the work of David Cox, who I'm going to show you in a minute. Another thing that was happening at the same time were technical developments, not only Chevrelle's colour possibilities of the colour wheel. We also had, in 1840, the development of the collapsible lead paint tube, developed by John Rand in USA, but it soon became vital to artists both in Britain and in France for plein air work, that you no longer took the little bladder, which I've got on the right there, painting with you with your pre-prepared paint, but you could have paint prepared by colourmen in collapsible lead tubes, or like toothpaste tubes. And this became vital to artists in the latter part of the 19th century. Turner never had the advantage of having a lovely little tube of paint like this, but the Pre-Raphaelites did, as did the Impressionists. And of course, it totally transformed the idea of painting directly from the motif. And there's a little example from Rand's patent from 1841, which is registered in Washington. And he also influenced many American artists as a result of that. And so this painting of Real Sands by David Cox. David Cox was from the Birmingham School of Watercolourists, but also painted in oil. And this is an oil painting, and very, very similar to Boudin or a Jonquind painting of 1854. So we're talking a good 15 years before the real blooming of Impressionism in France. And this is a painting of Real Sands. And Cox's work was, in fact, the only artist of the Birmingham School that Ruskin had any time for. And he said, Ruskin said of Cox that, let's have a look here. I have a little quote from Ruskin, I think, on this one. Oh, yes, he said that Cox was known for his simplicity and seriousness, and he commended him as such. And that from Ruskin at a period when he was championing the work of the Pre-Raphaelites was indeed high praise. And we can see it. There's a lovely airy atmosphere in this work by Cox of Real Sands, and this one's in Tate Britain, and a marvellous bit of painting it is too. And it does remind us that Impressionism was beginning even in the 1850s in a sort of way. But we must remember, going back to the whole idea of the pantheon of 19th century art, artists who are considered of vital importance to us today in our understanding of the development of French Impressionism and modern art were totally excluded from the European pantheon of art, as this picture exemplifies. I'll just talk about the British section on the left-hand side. We have Turner, we have Landseer, Millet, and Lorenzel Tadema. And this painting is in Nice, in the Beaux-Arts in Nice. And we have many other artists who have sunk without a trace. Of course, we have the great Dominique Ingres in the middle with his hand in a sort of Napoleonic gesture under his coat. You know, these artists were the artists who were thought of as the greats of the time, and how things have changed and how the trajectory of different careers has changed. And it is almost with the benefit of another 100 years that we can dare to look back now and see that their art was far more complicated in this period than we might have supposed. And indeed, in France, it had got to a crisis point by the early 1860s, with so many paintings being refused by the official salon. And Napoleon III, who had been basically rebuilding much of Paris. A lot of the buildings we see in Paris today were built in the reign of Napoleon III, particularly this building of the industrial building, was the home for what became known as the Salon des Refusés, which was for the rejected works from the Salon. There were so many works, and works that were shut out because of the size of some of the great salon artists like Couture and Jérôme. Other artists of up-and-coming artists didn't find room to show their work. And Napoleon III, whilst not sympathetic to modern art, he was a man who was aware of the feeling of the people, and he was also aware of that in Paris, that the mood could change in a volatile way. And so he enabled the building to be used for the Salon de la Fusée of 1863, which was to become a date in French art which is of massive importance. And of course, there we are on the right. I have a picture from the summer exhibition of 1870, which shows the same thing, that the society people went to basically to the Royal Academy to view the new paintings by Leighton and Millet and the big names of Victorian art, but the lesser known artists were often shut out, particularly people like Whistler, who did show occasionally at the Royal Academy, but he preferred to show at the Grosvenor Gallery. And there's a little later on in the 1870s when that opened by Sir Coutts Lindsay, and there's a little picture of the people going to the Grosvenor Gallery. So that was really London's equivalent of the Salon de la Fusée. And so the Salon de la Fusée opened in 1863 to this scandalous painting by Edward Manet, Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe. It was by Manet, who was a classically trained painter under Thomas Couture, and yet here he paints a nude young woman in a picnic scene in a Parisian, in a park in Paris, in a glade. And were it not for its connection with the Raphael Judgment of Paris engraving, which we can see illustrated on the left, it really still was very shocking, because it had people in everyday clothes depicted with a nude. Also, it was revolutionary in its technique too, in that Manet painted with quite broad brushstrokes. His great love of Spanish art is shown here, Velázquez and Zurbarán in its deep, dark, rich colours. But we can notice in the still life, the picnic that lies on to the left-hand corner on the ground, we can see the nascent French Impressionist technique beginning. And also at the Salon de la Fusée in 1863 was this marvellous painting of James Abbott McNeill Whistler's Mistress, Symphony in White No. 1, painted in 1861-1862, rejected at the Royal Academy in 1863, but Whistler was not a man to be put off easily, so he took it over to the Salon de la Fusée, where he had good relationships with French arts, and we can look at McNeill Whistler as being someone who is almost like a bridge between French art and British art of the period, an enormously important artist. And here is this painting here, which was shown and was of vital importance. So both these two paintings, probably the two most famous pictures from Salon de la Fusée of 1863, and paintings which have stood the test of time and really show a bold new approach to picture making and modernism. Quite shocking. And as we can see, a more conventional painting by James Tissot, 1863, celebrating the fashion of the time, which was for these long white dresses. I don't know a great deal about fashion, but I do know that in painting at this period, quite a lot of paintings depicted young women in these beautifully long white dresses. And there is, in fact, at Musée d'Orsay at the moment a retrospective exhibition of Tissot's work. And Tissot, once again, is being taken very seriously as a painter. He was a good friend of Edouard Manet. He painted in much more hard-edged technique than Manet, but he certainly depicted many of the same subjects, and many of his paintings have distinct parallels with his friend Edouard Manet. There is Whistler's painting that followed the one that was shown at the Salon de la Fusée, Symphony in White No. 2, The Little White Girl. And we can see the beginning, also the great influence of Japanese art that was coming into French art and British art. I say Whistler is a British artist. He's really an American artist, but he worked in Britain. And you can see the Japanese fan held in her hand and the porcelain. And again, Edward Manet, in his painting of Woman with a Parrot of 1866, is really developing upon this theme. And Manet's brushwork is loosening more and more as he develops a greater awareness of what else is going on in French art and the artists which become known as the French Impressionist group, whom he worked alongside. And Fantin Latour, also a pupil of Couture, here he is in 1870 painting his rather formal group, Homage to Manet, which includes Rodin, Basile, and Claude Monet sitting down there, and Émile Zola, the novelist. And Manet is a crucial figure in looking at the relationship between British art and French art. Indeed, even up to 1909, with our painter William Orpin, here he paints a homage to Manet in 1909 with the Gonzalez portrait of Manet's hanging on the wall behind Sickert and Wilson Steer, who become very important parts of the British response to Impressionism. I couldn't talk about Impressionism without mentioning the great effect that photography was having upon art at the time. And here we have the photographer Nadar, or he was known as Nadar, and here he is working with the typical camera of the time. He is known for going up in his balloon and photographing Paris from the air. And the photographs from high vantage points were becoming highly influential upon the painters, particularly Claude Monet and Camille Pissarro. And there we have a Claude Monet view. And I've taken a detail from one of Nadar's photographs looking down the street. And we can see that photography played an important part in the development of Impressionism. It was different in France to England. In England, photography tended towards influencing artists to greater detail and under Ruskinian principles. But in France, it was more the optical effects of the blurs of photography, the movement of traffic and of people that interested them. And of course, that is something that fascinated the great Edward Muybridge in his movement of animals. And then the tide really broke, and we talked about this before in other talks on Victorian art, about the great trial of 1878. The Ruskin-Whistler trial, where Whistler, irked by Ruskin's criticism of his work, took Ruskin to court. And Ruskin, too ill at the time to defend, answer in court, he had Edward Burne-Jones and he had the QC Sir John Holker. And the fuss was all about this painting, which had been shown at the Grosvenor Gallery, Nocturne, Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket, painted in 1875. It's now in the Detroit Institute of Arts. And what an amazing painting for its date. 1875, we get an almost abstract painting, and yet it isn't entirely abstract. Whistler was interested in the effects of nighttime scenes and indeed of fireworks. Sir John Holker said, "What is the subject of a Nocturne in Black and Gold, The Falling Rocket?" Whistler, "It is a night piece and represents the fireworks at Cremorne Gardens." Sir John Holker, "Not a view of Cremorne Gardens then." Whistler, "If it were a view of Cremorne, I certainly would bring about nothing but disappointment on the part of the beholders. It is an artistic arrangement. That is why I call it a nocturne." Sir John Holker, "Did it take much time for you to paint Nocturne in Black and Gold? How soon did you knock it off?" Whistler, "Oh, I knock off one possibly in a couple of days, one a day to work, the other to finish it. The painting measures 24 inches by 18 inches. Sir John Holker, "The labour of a day for which you ask 200 guineas? Whistler's reply, "No, I ask it for the knowledge I have gained in the work of a lifetime." And those comments by Whistler were to resound really into the world of modern art, because it isn't about craft, it is about the experience of a lifetime. And Holker's view and Ruskin's view was that it should have shown greater signs of industry, that it couldn't be considered anything but a study or a sketch. And yet, of course, we know Ruskin had supported Turner's very late works, which were equally abstract. And so we can see a difference. Now I want to point out a little bit of difference of paintings of a similar period. We have Claude Monet's painting here at Argenteuil of the bridge. And we have a Whistler one of Old Battersea Bridge in 1872. We can see Whistler is far more influenced here by the Japanese print. He's also interested in making a painting work within itself in decorative terms. He is certainly conscious of replicating Japanese prints in his art, but both are forms of an Impressionism that take different courses. Whistler's form of Impressionism and the French form of Impressionism, but both speak to one another. And Whistler's paint is very thinly applied, whereas Monet's can be quite thickly applied and has a sense of impasto, and is more similar to the approach of the Delacroix type brushwork than indeed the Whistler one. And in Britain, a response to it by 1880, response to both photography and to Impressionism, took a very different form. I mean, an artist who was working in the Pool of London, as did Claude Monet at this period, 10 years before when he had come to London, had painted views similar to this, but Atkinson Grimshaw was far more informed by photography as well, and we would say the work of the Pre-Raphaelites. Although using similar colours to Whistler, he has a much more hard-edged style, and he exhibits his nocturnes in fastidious and painstaking detail, as in this particular painting of the Pool of London. And there's a contemporary photograph from 1872 taken in London, just looking across to St Magnus Church across the River Thames. And yes, so now the further approaches within the city. Yes, we've got Caillebotte, a great French Impressionist artist who often painted street scenes in Paris. Some of his great paintings were begun as a sketch. I took this painting as there's a sketch for the painting, which I think I photographed in Toledo Art Gallery. Very radical in composition with its the crisscross of the iron-girded bridge, which he softened a little bit in the final result. Pissarro view, which echoes what I've been talking about with the photography, looking down into the Champs-Élysées. And yet, an artist in London, painting St Martin in the Fields, William Logstyle. Now, his painting is informed by Impressionism, but also photography, but it certainly isn't plein air, and it's certainly much more composed, much more in the Tissot vein of using a new understanding of colour. And indeed, if there is any freedom of brushwork, it certainly isn't that of a Claude Monet, which is exhibited here, but it's equally a study of light and of what happens on a rainy day. But British art also was very concerned with anecdote. And we notice this entering into artists of the New English Art Club and the Newlyn School as well, that even when they're painting with quasi-impressionist colours, they are still maybe have a narrative within their painting. An absolutely marvellous French Impressionist painting from this period is, of course, this one by Monet, looking across the Channel. We have it painted in 3 bands, and I thought I would show this next to the Whistler, painted at a similar period, the idea of the bands, the horizontal quality, which was so influenced by Japanese prints, and we can see I put a Japanese print in the top right-hand corner there. And Monet was equally influenced by Japanese prints, and Japanese prints were coming into dealers in London, and Japanese art and Oriental art was influencing even academic art of the period. And often we find in the backgrounds of Millet's work Japanese bits of furniture, and various artists of the period are referring to this craze for Japanese, everything Oriental. And here we are. This points up another great difference between British art and French art of the period. This is a study for the William Powell Frith railway station, which I've talked about before. Very loose study, in fact, when you consider the painting in the bottom right-hand corner is the final finished result, which is in Royal Holloway College, but they have a sketch for it. And the sketch is, in fact, far more akin to a Monet than indeed the final resulting painting, and in my view, much more pleasing in a sense than the final finished painting aesthetically. Claude Monet was, when he painted his series at Gare Saint-Lazare, was positively required there to be plenty of steam and the crowd to be obscured by plumes of smoke and all the activity of the railway station in Paris. So Monet's concern is entirely different to a British artist's concern, where it's about narrative, it's not about the trains, it's not about the atmosphere, it's about the social story that's going on. Monet isn't concerned about that at all. He's concerned about light, and his painting as a result is an absolute masterpiece. But of course, the world of the steam trains and the new stations was influencing artists and enabling them to get to new places to paint quite rapidly from London. And this is, of course, very important when we consider artists going to different colonies all over on the French coast in Brittany, but also going to Cornwall, where the Newland School set up, and it wouldn't have happened had it not been for the railway being extended in 1877 in Britain. So another artist that we sadly lost in the Franco-Prussian War was Frederick Basile, and he combined his Impressionism with the formality of salon painting, and he was able to combine these two very, very successfully. So his picnic scenes and his scenes of society people, of the bourgeoisie, but painted in an impressionist manner, were highly successful. And Basile, of course, was very kind to his friend Claude Monet in loaning his studio. And Monet stored a lot of his paintings and painted in Basile's studio. And Basile, unfortunately, lost in the war, and we never really know exactly what a great painter he might have become. And look at Renoir on this painting on the right, 1867. This is one of his much more formal paintings before he becomes working with Claude Monet. He's beginning his journey as an impressionist, but at this stage, I mean, he is as fascinated by these white dresses as, say, our G.F. Watts at the period, painting Sophia Dalrymple. There are lots of these links, and it's much more confusing than it might have appeared, than it now appears, when we can categorize things and put things into neat boxes as this thing was impressionist, or this person was a part of this school or that school. There was a to and fro between different artists, but certainly the up-and-coming Impressionists were absolutely revolutionary, as indeed was this painting on the right, where one of Manet's last paintings, the Bar at the Folies Bergère, painted in 1882, one of the most important paintings in the beginning of modern art. But it echoes a painting by James Tissot, who had begun to work in London. Tissot had been part of the Paris Commune and came over to London and settled in London with his mistress. And he lived in Holland Park. And this painting prefigures the Manet painting. And the two artists knew one another. And one can see, whilst they're of two different classes here, that the woman in the Pretty Women of Paris here is not of the same class as the young woman in the Bar at the Folies Bergère, and she doesn't exhibit the same sadness that we get in the Manet painting. We certainly would imagine that the two artists were in conversation with one another about such things. Tissot loved the great fashions of London, particularly at this period. Ruskin was horrified by Tissot's paintings. He called them mere hand-painted colour photographs. But would he have liked Edgar Degas' paintings for this period? Well, look at Degas' paintings, much more revolutionary, and yet a formally trained painter, a great draftsman and wonderful artist. But Tissot, to our eyes these days, is perhaps a much more attractive painter in that he knew when to stop. He could leave things in a sort of what we call now in what they would have called in the 19th century an unfinished state, but what we would call now really impressionist. And so that's a difference between two paintings separated by the channel, but also by a different view of how to paint and how to depict fashion. And both were shown in a fascinating show at Chicago Art Institute about art and fashion, which was on in 2011. And it brought paintings by Tissot and Manet together, and Degas and Courbet together. And it was fascinating to see that the fashions of the day, the colours that had been so enabled by Chevrelle's colour theories and the dyeing techniques were also being painted by the painters. And so that was fascinating. And as I said, the Franco-Prussian War also meant not only did Tissot come over to London, but far more importantly, Claude Monet came to London. as did Camille Pissarro. And he took up lodgings in Upper Norwood, Camille Pissarro, and Monet painted on the Embankment and painted some absolutely wonderful paintings in London at this period. 1870, this is before the first French Impressionist exhibition. And he is painting boldly. This is at a time, a painting like this would never have made it into the Royal Academy or indeed into the Salon, but it could quite easily, it was an innovative painting because he is actually analysing light in this painting and really getting to grips with this new movement of Impressionism, which is so challenged and so changed the whole art of the 19th century. And there we have his friend Camille Pissarro, who was living at Norwood near Penge, and that is the Crystal Palace. Remember the great Paxton's great Crystal Palace, the great exhibition, had been removed from Hyde Park and taken to Sydenham and re-erected there. And that's a photograph of it after it had been put into Sydenham. And there's a painting by William White Warren of the Crystal Palace, painted in the 1880s. And there is the one from 1871, painted by Camille Pissarro. What a wonderful painting that is by Pissarro, capturing London at that time. And indeed, the Crystal Palace was sort of out of London at that time. The whole of the great wen of South London hadn't built up, and Sydenham was quite separate from the main city. But you could travel in by the train, and there we are. This is the Lordship's Lane station at Dulwich. Not so green and like this nowadays, but here we are. Here's Pissarro's view, painted at Dulwich in 1871. And again, a wonderful painting that you can see in the National Gallery in London. And yes, Pissarro, I think some of Pissarro's finest paintings were painted in London. They are very unassuming paintings, but they really get to grips with this new idea of painting vital paintings of unconventional views. Perhaps it echoes a little bit of Rain, Steam and Speed by Turner. We know that Monet and Pissarro visited the National Gallery around this time, so it's not inconceivable that that particular painting did bear an influence upon this little sketch. But it's a marvellous painting by Pissarro, and I would recommend you go there. Another artist from the French Impressionist group, he was a British artist, Alfred Sisley, although he worked all the time, most of the time in France, but during the early 1870s, like Monet and Pissarro, worked in London. And I point to these two paintings, both from 1874, Walter Graves painting the old Battersea Bridge in 1874. That's the bridge that Whistler painted many, many times and did many etchings of. You can see that's in quite a conventional style. It's got quite a nice painting, but certainly it couldn't be considered impressionist anyway. But look at Sisley's painting, very unconventional, painted under Hampton Court Bridge, and has all the movement, all the light of a Monet. And the French Impressionists love this idea of it restricting light and making working from underneath a bridge. It provided a great deal of scope for some of their experiments and understanding of painting the light. And we've got the rowers there going under Hampton Court Bridge. He painted this one at the weir nearby, and I think this is a marvellous painting too. Very modern painting. Again, this would have been something absolutely unthinkable by many of the British artists at the time. And it was causing, but young British artists were beginning to notice these so-called Impressionist paintings, and they were very excited about it. They weren't so excited about an education at the Royal Academy, which was rigorous, which didn't seem as exciting as the art world of Paris. And we can honestly say that following the Franco-Prussian War, that the whole axis of the art world moved over to Paris. And indeed, it was Lord Leighton and Millet on Grant's death tried to restore the reputation of the Academy, particularly Leighton, and he did encourage some people who we might not now consider impressionists, but he did encourage in more innovative and less stultified art. But I doubt he would have encouraged a painting like that. Another artist who came to London, or he wasn't an artist at the time, was Vincent Van Gogh, and he came to work for Goupil's. He'd come from The Hague. He was 20 years old. He was working for his uncle, and he had worked for a picture dealer in The Hague. He then came to London, the London branch of the picture dealer, and in 1873, he was not a painter at the time, but I once met the painter Millet on the street just after I had been lucky enough to see several of his paintings. Not the least beautiful is an autumn landscape, Chill October. This painting by Millet on the left, not impressionist at all, but it was a great influence upon the young Vincent Van Gogh. And he cites it in a number of his letters to Theo, even up into the time when he moved into became a serious painter. And Van Gogh's early art education was in London. And indeed, he had a very sophisticated art education because he's working for a picture dealer, going to the Royal Academy and seeing such paintings as this. And this was to have an effect upon him. And certainly he brought all this knowledge with him, and it comes out in his paintings. So there is this lovely link between the continent and London, and indeed the trajectory of these two men's careers. Millet's career sort of waned after the turn of the new century, whereas Van Gogh, as we know, is probably one of the 6 greatest artists who's ever lived. And Van Gogh talks about this painting by Sir Luke Fildes, The Empty Chair, that is Dickens' empty chair at Gad's Hill. And later in 1888 in Arles, he paints his own empty chair, one for Gauguin and one for himself. And he remembers the Victorian painting of Luke Fildes, the graphic illustrator. And so there is a link. There are all these links between British art and the art of the new school. Really, the tide broke with this. The name Impressionism happened as a result of this exhibition in Paris in 1874 at Nadar's studio, where was the first Impressionist exhibition of the group which became known as the Impressionists. And this was the wonderful painting Impression Sunrise, to which the whole group became known as, and Claude Monet, Renoir, Sisley particularly, all became the great stars of this new movement, and their paintings were very, very radical. And of course they were lampooned, as all new art movements are. And here's some things that came out in Punch, and this is Mistaken Impressions. And so these are just parodies of Impressionist paintings, which were amusing. There is truth to them in some sense, that there are distortions of scale, that the Impressionists certainly took unusual viewpoints, that there were gridiron backgrounds and sweeping perspectives, that they focused in on things that other artists considered peripheral details. But anyway, that's one of the cartoons of the time. And we can see also that there is a link between the art of fashion and Impressionism, no more so than the artist Auguste Renoir, whose great paintings, they are marvellous Impressionist paintings, but they often depict bourgeois young women by the Seine, beautiful painted paintings in this lovely soft touch that Renoir has. But equally, they echo the fashions that both Tissot and Millet were painting at the same time. And there's Tissot's October, painted in London, in Holland Park, and Millet's of the great artist Louise Jopling, which is now in the National Gallery in London. Millet's painting actually is painted in quite a loose technique, which was a great influence upon the young John Singer Sargent, who we'll hear of in a minute. Again, French Impressionism was influenced by the Japanese prints of Hokusai, and there is Claude Monet's painting at Belle-Île on the French coast, influenced by the Japanese print, and yet a rather stultified Victorian painting by James Clark Hooke, and that was a typical painting of the same date in the Royal Academy. So you can see what an innovation someone like Claude Monet was doing with painting seascapes. Whereas Hooke was a very celebrated artist at the time, Claude Monet was almost penniless. And yet Henry Moore, not Henry Moore the sculptor, but the Henry Moore of the Victorian era, the painter, he was influenced very much by the Impressionists. And here is a painting of his, Early Morning in Mounts Bay. His technique may look a little bit more tight than, shall we say, the Monet, and yet he was definitely influenced by French Impressionism, painted a number of these seascapes at the time, which were considered quite innovative, and some were hung in the Royal Academy. An artist who was indeed much more adventurous was the Scot, William Mctaggart. And here's his painting called The Storm. And now, William Mctaggart was known for painting plein air in all weathers. And believe me, in Scotland, that must be really, really something, to lash your canvas onto two poles on the beach and paint in all kind of weather. And he comes up with a painting like this, 1880. So it's quite a highly innovative painting for its period. And I would suggest that you look at William Mctaggart, because he is an interesting artist. He includes some of the fisher folk on the shore up in the east coast of Scotland, and they are interesting paintings. Some can be seen in the National Gallery of Scotland. Now, the great John Singer Sargent, born in Florence, of an American artist, but who made his career in London. But he travelled internationally and was a very good friend of Claude Monet. And at Farnham House in Broadway, in High Street in Broadway in Gloucestershire, every summer, John Singer Sargent and a number of other artists would meet, and they would paint landscapes. And this is an example from 1885 of a painting by John Singer Sargent, not one of his big portraits of the period, one of his well-known the Wertheimers, or one of those great portraits that we've come to know him for. But here is his form of Impressionism, painted in Britain, in Gloucestershire. He painted many lovely paintings around Broadway, and they are marvellous paintings, and we should not dismiss them just because we have a view of John Singer Sargent that his paintings are not as adventurous as Monet. Indeed, when he painted alongside Monet, he could paint beautifully and wonderfully. And a painting like this really shows some of the great technician that Sargent was as an artist. Here's his painting, John Singer Sargent's painting of Monet painting at the edge of a wood in just outside Paris. And a painting that was in the Royal Academy in 1885, influenced by French Impressionism by John Singer Sargent, is his Carnation Lily, Lily, Rose. And this painting, which is now in Tate Britain, is both impressionistic, it is decorative, but it also employs a great deal of wonderful observation and is, shall we say, a different response to Impressionism. It takes, and one that was highly influential on a number of British artists. So we have the Chinese lanterns, the lilies, and the different light sources which so fascinated the French Impressionists. So a highly successful painting of this period, from the Broadway period of John Singer Sargent. Of course, women artists were beginning to get much better known, and we have the great Mary Cassatt, Bertha Morisot in her wonderful painting here, The Interior, a beautiful painting. We have Auguste Rodin's head of Gwen John, who they were lovers at one stage. Gwen John painted in Paris, and like so many artists in Britain, trained in Paris and worked in Paris because this was the place to be, place to study art and to mix with some of the great art of antiquity, as well as it was seen as a much more exciting place to practice. And certainly once some of the worst extremes of troubles were over in Paris, it became a safe place for British artists to work and to study and to attend an atelier. And it was a different type of training to that they would have got in London. So some of the artists like Gustave Moreau were highly innovative, and they encouraged innovation within their atelier, which was in a sense discouraged in the Royal Academy. The artist who was probably the most influential upon British artists of an impressionist leaning was Bastian Lefarge, and his paintings of the rural poor. This is some 30 years after Jean-Francois Millet's paintings, but were very, very influential upon an artist like George Clawson of the New English Art Club. He set up the group called the New English Art Club in 1886. with a number of other artists, and that's a Clausen painting there, painted in partly plein air, partly studio, but beautifully painted, a really broad technique in places, large paintings too, much bigger than the earlier paintings of people like Claude Monet. And there's a later Clausen painting. Clausen's paintings obviously have a narrative element. They hark back to the paintings of Millet, Jean-François Millet, the Barbizon painter. Stanhope Forbes also was an artist of, he was of Danish extraction, but working in Britain. He worked down at Newlyn. The railway was opened up in 1877, and he worked down in Newlyn, and he founded the Newlyn School of Artists, which depicted fisherfolk on the shore. And his paintings are painted in an impressionistic technique, fully aware of the light that he had seen in the Claude Monet paintings, and he had worked also in Paris, so he was very au fait with French art as well. And there's an example of Stanhope Forbes' beach scene at St Ives, painted in 1884, painted in plein air, and that gives you an example of the type of work that went on there. Also interesting too, in composition, Stanhope Forbes painted these sketches and the more developed studio works as well. Another great artist of the Newlyn School was Bramley, who painted his well-known painting, The Hopeless Dawn, which I'll probably be talking about in my lecture on Ruskin in a few weeks' time. And another Scottish artist who I would suggest you look up is James Guthrie. This is one called Hard at It, and this is hard at painting out on the beach in Scotland, and a lovely loose technique of an impressionist technique, leading to what we call Scottish colourist painting 15 years later. So Guthrie's work and the work of Lavery were very, very important, and they influenced a whole new school of painting, up particularly in Glasgow. And we think of the art school and John Rennie Mackintosh, but also think of artists who are working at this time in this blocky, flat brush style, which was very a particular Scottish response to Impressionism. No greater artist in his British response to Impressionism was Walter Sickert, a German-born artist, but who spent his life in Britain. After forays across the Channel, he was befriended by Edgar Degas, and some of these paintings from Dieppe, the one on the left is painted in Dieppe and can be seen in Ashmolean Museum. Sickert's work really did champion the work of Degas. He loved the theatre as much as Degas did as well, and that's a painting from the balcony of one of the London music halls. And so he was trying to do for London what Degas had done for Paris. Later, Sickert developed into what we know as the Camden Town Group, and that's beyond the remit of our talk tonight. But another group of painters who were very influenced by the Impressionists and Post-Impressionists were led by Walter Sickert, who also, like Monet, worked in Venice as well. And so there was a group of artists who definitely knew one another and brought back news from abroad and excited young artists here. And Sickert's work is, at its best, very innovative and exciting work, as is Philip Wilson Steer's work as well. And this is a British assimilation of Impressionism, beginning to get something from Pissarro's broken brushwork. There are indications of pointillism here, and yet it's a British response to it. The girls upon the pier. So you could see that being painted by someone like William Palfrith in a very fastidious style. This is a Steer response to it. Also, I would say Henry Tonks as well is an artist one might look at this period as well, who develops this very British response to Impressionism. The old men of British art by this time, by 1890, were Millet and Watts. But who would believe an artist like John Everett Millet would paint such a painting as The Moon is Up in 1890, painted in almost a Turneresque haze, full of colour, of that twilight colour, perhaps a little bit Whistlerian in some ways, and yet definitely we could say the whole art world have been moved by the approach of the Impressionists. And Millet, whilst not citing them by name in his thoughts on art today, he does obliquely mention Impressionism. and Watts too, in his After the Deluge, 1886 to 91, this terrific painting looking into the sun. I doubt whether a painting like that could have been painted in the earlier part of Watts's career had he not, out of the corner of his eye, noticed some of the new paintings that were beginning to creep onto the Royal Academy walls, certainly on the walls of the Grosvenor Gallery. These were things that were entering British art, and it changed it forever. And so there's a Millet landscape, different to his others, but it's one called The Moon is Up, towards the end of his career. But I think a very worthy painting for its time. And here we just a few examples of this great link between all European artists and of the period. Claude Monet returning to Venice in 1908, painting the Grand Canal. Whistler painting in St. Mark's Square in Venice in 1875. Turner painting in Venice in 1834. And Sickert painting in Venice in the last year of the Queen's reign in 1901. Art has all these links, and we should never see it as we like to cut and dry things into little books and schools of art, but art always spills over. Different artists from different periods influence one another, and that is something that's very, very fascinating about it. William Orpin, the man who I showed you painted his homage to Manet, was obsessed by the work of Edgar Degas, and here is his painting Sunlight, a typical early 20th century painting, I suppose, in some ways, but absolutely indebted to Degas in its technique. And that's William Orpin, an artist who's recently emerged again with an exhibition at the Dulwich Picture Gallery, and again being considered an artist worth looking at. And we just conclude tonight with two paintings, one by Stanhope Forbes called The Munition Girls from 1918, how his art, using his understandings of colour, the things he's learnt painting plein air, but he brings it into the service of the war effort as a war artist, as did Dame Laura Knight. And so we hear a picture of the munition girls within a factory working. There are indications as he's thinking back to the Carnation Lily Rose by Sargent with a light against the dark. And then we have an artist, again, perhaps sunk without a trace, Wellington Firs. Diana of the Uplands, a very famous painting at the time. Painted out on Dartmoor, I believe, but painted in very loose brush marks, reminiscent of Sargent, but also an antecedents in Claude Monet. And so there are links all through the history of art of this period that are worth exploring. And I hope I've given you a few of these links tonight that have showed you something different about British and French art and the relationship between the two during this period. If you're interested, Claude Monet did return to London in the early 20th century and painted these marvellous Impressionist paintings while staying at the Savoy. Much more wealthy man than his first visit in 1870, 71. And here he is painting in a London smog. He loved the fog in London. It helped his Impressionist painting no end. And there's a painting of the House of Lords looking across the river, and one of Westminster Bridge. And for any of you who are interested, I'm going to be talking on American artists of the late 19th century, and indeed American Impressionism of this period. And if any of you are interested, I can give you a link for this sometime. Anyway, I think I've spoken long enough now, and I'm quite able and willing to take questions.